Our gospel reading this morning comes from the 3rd chapter of Matthew. Matthew and Luke are the only gospels that speak at all of Jesus as a young person, mentioning his birth. Matthew sort of mentions that Jesus is born and then tells the story of the Magi, after which Jesus and his family must flee to Egypt to escape Herod. Later, after Herod dies, they return and settle in Nazareth. And this is the next story that Matthew then tells us. He tells of John baptizing in the wilderness and then of Jesus coming to see John. Listen for what the Spirit may speak to us through these words. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." Then John consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In my office, I have a number of books with sermons by Barbara Brown Taylor, along with another of her books on preaching. She's famous for being a great preacher, and I have quoted her often in sermons. But a few years ago, she wrote a very different sort of book entitled Leaving Church, a memoir of faith. And it's about just pretty much what the title would suggest. And here's just a bit of that. I want to read you a bit from the introduction that she wrote. "By now, I expected to be a seasoned parish minister wearing black clergy shirts grown gray from frequent washing. I expected to love the children who hung on my legs after Sunday morning services until they grew up and had children of their own. I even expected to be buried wearing the same red vestments in which I was ordained. Today, those vestments are hanging in the sacristy of an Anglican church in Kenya. My church pension is frozen, and I am as likely to spend Sunday mornings with friendly Quakers, Presbyterians, or Congregationalists as I am with the Episcopalians who remain my closest kin. Sometimes I even keep the Sabbath with a cup of steaming tea on my front porch, watching towhees vie for the highest perch in the poplar tree while God watches me. These days I earn my living teaching school, not leading worship. And while I still dream of opening a small restaurant in Clarksville or volunteering in an eye clinic in Nepal, there is no guarantee that I will not run off with the circus before I am through. This is not the life I planned or the life I recommend to others. But it is the life that turned out to be mine." When the book first came out, many of the pastors with whom I socialized agreed with a colleague who labeled Taylor a whiner who should have never gone into ordained ministry in the first place. But I could not dismiss her quite so easily. I found that I resonated with her frustrations with the world and with the church. And in this most recent year, my own sense of skepticism and frustration with the world and its institutions and humanity has only grown. That can be challenging for faith. And the combination of post-Christmas letdown and winter doldrums and news of yet the latest shooting doesn't help. The Christmas message speaks of peace on earth, of God entering decisively into human history, of God's new day beginning to appear. But all these centuries later, the kingdom still seems a long way off. The world is still filled with horrible suffering and violence, and hate and greed and selfishness. And the church often just shrugs. Worse, the church too often is an agent of prejudice and hate and greed and violence. Today, barely out of the Christmas season, heading deep into the heart of winter, we once more hear the story of the beginnings of Jesus' ministry as he comes to be baptized by John. It's a strange story, one that troubled the early Christians who first wrote the Gospels. I mean, after all, John the Baptist clearly stated his baptism was one for repentance. So why would Jesus need to come and be baptized by John? Matthew tells us that John objected, but that Jesus insists, saying it's somehow necessary to fulfill all righteousness. It's not quite certain what that means, but it's clearly about being connected to God's plan, to God's will, and by his baptism, Jesus forever changes the meaning of baptism. Previously, baptism had been a cleansing ritual. The water symbolized the washing away of sin, leaving one pure and spotless, able to stand clean in the presence of God. That symbolism is still preserved in the Christian baptism, but Jesus' baptism adds so much more. In his baptism, Jesus is publicly named and proclaimed as God's own. The Spirit comes onto him and he is marked for his ministry as God's Son, ministry that confronts power and so leads to rejection and derision and a cross. Here, Jesus is connected to the long narrative of God's purposes being worked out in the world, to the Spirit hovering over the waters at creation, to the Israelites passing through the Jordan waters from slavery to freedom, to the pouring out of the Spirit on ancient prophets. And here, the story of Jesus' ministry begins. The strange story of a strange Messiah who looks nothing like Messiahs were supposed to look, or like the Messiah I would prefer. One who ends war and hate and oppression and greed with the snap of a finger. In the early centuries of the church, Christians celebrated Jesus' baptism as a big feast day with special significance, unlike Christmas, which they largely ignored. That's unimaginable in our world. But the centrality of Jesus' baptism for those early Christians may perhaps guide me through that post-Christmas letdown, winter doldrums, and a faith challenged by a world and a church that so often look little like the kingdom. As those early Christians realized, Jesus' baptism was not the coronation of a hero Messiah who would magically bring God's peaceable kingdom. The new day that Jesus inaugurated was about God's will done on earth, and that begins at his baptism when Jesus is marked as the one who will do God's will, who will be devoted to God's will. He will refuse to be a conquering hero, will remain loyal to the often inscrutable purposes of God no matter what. Jesus will not substitute his own visions of the kingdom, his own desire for world peace, his own temptations to use his power. He will remain totally entrusted to God. And in my baptism, and in each of your baptisms, we too are claimed, for our baptisms are modeled on Jesus. Our baptisms are not magic potions or holy inoculations or guarantees of a good and safe life. They are an adoption. In our baptisms, we are claimed and joined to Christ. We are connected to the long narrative of God's purposes being worked out in the world. We are marked for ministry, for doing the will of God above all else. It is a life of service, of ministry, of doing God's will over our own. A life modeled on Jesus. A life where others see Jesus in us. And in our baptism, God also gives the promise of the Spirit. And by the Spirit, we are able to experience the presence of the risen Christ as individuals and as a faith community. And the world may still look little like the kingdom, but when we live into our baptisms, when we allow the Spirit to strengthen and guide us, God's new day becomes visible in us. Not always, or even often. Very often, our fear, our desire for comfort and safety, our preference for power over the way of Jesus causes us to turn away from the new transformed life promised in baptism. As G.K. Chesterton long ago observed, the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. Too often, the church has led the way in that. And so it's no great surprise that people become cynical. They leave church or struggle with faith. But here and there, in individuals and in faith communities, people make the choice to live into their baptismal identities, their joined to Christ identities. It's never perfect, never without missteps. But when it happens, there is a glimpse of something beyond how things are. Many of us, perhaps most of us, have caught such a glimpse in the faith of some person, in the work of some congregation. For some of us, it is the clearest glimpse of Christ, clearest glimpse of God's new day that we have. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the beloved." God still speaks at baptism. This is my son. This is my daughter. And God's grace envelops us. God's Spirit is poured out on us. And we are marked for new and transformed that make God's new day visible to the world. Thanks be to God.